Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance will include atheist nuns, existential dread, and a deconstruction of 90s musicals. All this and more on this episode of Created Things. And welcome to Created Things, the only podcast where the hosts are both tortured and starving, but not for art reasons. My name is artist and psychotherapist Jacob Flores Popcheck. With me is my good and excellent friend, Father Gabriel Toretta. How you doing, Father?
Excellent. I'm all of these things. Yeah. I know. Tortured.
Are you tortured and starving today?
Surprisingly less starving than I probably should be for since it's like a Friday, but I guess it's not a Friday in Lent yet. So anyway, there it is. But I was visiting some friends and yesterday, and I've gotten really into lately making Sichuanese Chinese food.
Awesome.
Yeah, so like the kind of sort of very spicy food from the western part of China that is like unreal. It's like the best food on the whole planet. So I ate like, I don't know, it's sort of like snake eating, where you sort of eat enough food for like 20 days, but then
sure.
Unlike a snake, then I just like
line and then a huge
exactly
bubble in the center of you and then straight line again.
This is kind of how I feel right now. So I confess slightly less starving than usual, perhaps. Yes. And yourself?
I follow a lot of like animal attack videos. For some reason, this calms me. Watching animals attack dumb humans. But occasionally an animal attacking other animal video will slide through the cracks. And the worst thing I've ever seen is like just the perfect outline of a mammal inside the center of a snake. It's just truly a hellish image.
That's so glorious. Just look, there it is. That's wow, that was a whole weasel or whatever it is. It's amazing.
Yeah, beaver, depending on the size of the snake. But as for how I'm doing, I'm also less starving. I postponed this podcast by 5 minutes so I could throw down some leftover curry. But I am pretty tortured, and that's kind of why I wanted to do this episode today, because to let people behind the curtain a little bit on our personal lives, you and I, and correct me if you think this is an unfair characterization, but I think you and I have both been in a place recently where we are working extremely hard on our respective art forms. Me really, really pushing the limits of, my illustrative career, and just trying to get myself out there professionally. And you, as you work on your dissertation, just writing and eating and sleeping and breathing medieval texts. And, these are arts, and it's brought up a lot of anxiety for me personally. It's brought up a lot of those sort of existential questions about identity and profession and things like this. And I think as an artist, whenever I start to think about those things, this archetype / cliche of the tortured artist comes up, can't not come up. And it just so happened that around this time that this was coming up for me, I saw 3 movies in one weekend, all of which were about the theme of the tortured artist. And I
just to be cruel, just because God
just to be cruel.
has a sense of humor sometimes. Good, yes.
And by far the most competent of these is a film that listeners can watch on Netflix now. It's called Tick, Tick, Boom. It's the directorial debut of Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was famous for, creating and starring in Hamilton and In the Heights on Broadway. And it stars Andrew Garfield. It is a musical. Andrew Garfield had never sung or played piano, didn't know how to do either before the making of this film, learned exclusively to make this film. But did a very, very competent job. I'm sure you and I will have different opinions on it, but it just encapsulated so many of my feelings of my own artistic struggle, and I think it captured it hit all the beats of the nuances of like the tortured artist cliche that I actually encouraged off air Father Gabriel to check out this movie. We've not talked really about our feelings on it at all, and so this is sort of going to be a deconstructed thought process on the movie itself, but mainly we're just using it as a jumping off point to talk about the highs and lows and the pros and cons and the truths and the falsehoods of this role and this archetype that I think so many of us in the arts, whether it's writing for you, Father, or, graphic arts for me, or where it's dancing or performing in some way, that we all really fall into and can really either lift us up or tear us down depending on how we buy into it. So maybe it'd be good, just since I'm kind of queuing up the movie here and everything, I don't know your thoughts on it. Give us the 5-second Father Gabriel review of Tick Tick Boom on Netflix.
I thought it was if anybody hasn't seen it or hasn't heard anything about it, it's sort of a biopic about a guy who wrote the musical Rent. The thing itself is like a sort of film staging adaptation of a piece that he in fact wrote that was also sort of autobiopic-y,
autobiographical musical,
autobiographical musical, basically. So it's basically a filming of that, more or less. So I thought, it was very enjoyable to watch. It was a really interesting experience. Particularly Andrew Garfield is really talented. At what he's doing. A lot of the actors are quite good. Filming and some of the sort of visual and conceptual imaginations I think are really interesting. I found it the experience of it I found to be a lot like watching Rent itself, which is to say that, like, while it's happening, it's sort of interesting and kind of fun, and there are things about it that are good, and there are things about it that aren't to my taste. But ultimately is sort of consistently throughout emotionally manipulative and is fundamentally false. And so that's sort of what I came through to on the end is like, in the end, it's nice because I felt like it's so consistently true to the experience of Rent and what Rent is, that it was actually very good as a biopic of the author, so he manages to like performatively enact both the strengths and weaknesses of like this great creation of his. The great weakness, of course, though, is that still it is fundamentally presenting a false vision of all kinds of things about what it means to be a human being and an artist. And so I think it has weaknesses, but I enjoyed it fine enough watching it, and I'm sure it'll be very popular.
And I will say this, so Rent, again, we have listeners all over the map here. So for those of you who are not sort of literate in musical theater, wasn't a little theater nerd like me, Rent is also a musical in the 90s. It's set against the backdrop of the AIDS crisis, but that's really incidental to the plot, almost insultingly so. The main premise is sort of these very self-involved douchebag young artists slumming it in New York. Also semi-autobiographical, real hard word to say, for the story of Jonathan Larson, who wrote that show, and then also, goes, is the inspiration and the main character of Tick Tick Boom. And I will say really quickly, I don't know if you're aware of this, Father, like, your opinion on Rent is not a hot take.
Oh, is that right?
It was a hot take 15 years ago. It is now the established thought on that show, which is that
I'm ahead of my time.
Which is that the use of the AIDS crisis as a backdrop is a very sort of like ham-fisted straight white man way of saying that he's woke and doesn't actually make sense in the show. The general consensus is like it is a very provocative and interesting show, but not provocative because it's inspiring, provocative because it shows how dangerous it is to be the sort of artist who thinks that the sun rises and sets on what you made. Mm-hmm. And I think even the creators of Tick Tick Boom, Lin-Manuel Miranda and Andrew Garfield specifically, have said in interviews that this was to pay respect for someone who did profoundly change musical theater, but also to study what a deeply broken and odd person he was, to the degree that the movie actually opens, I believe, saying all what you were about to see are all true events except for the parts that Jonathan made up.
Right.
And so it's a telling of his own story, but they're admitting like, yeah, but he was kind of full of shit at the same time.
Right.
And I think that self-awareness is cool. But I just want to put that out there that we're not necessarily like shitting on Rent in a way that established musical theater persons would not also shit on Rent.
No, that's really interesting for me because it was the first sort of like Broadway thing I think I ever saw. It came to Phoenix or Tempe, Arizona, when I was going to college at Arizona State University. Like my first or second year. If we have any gentle Gen Z listeners, cover your ears because this was before you were born. But it was either 2001 or 2002. Like my girlfriend took me to it and intentionally didn't tell me what it was about because she thought if I knew what it was about ahead of time, I would say no and wouldn't come.
True.
Which was probably true. And I remember watching it and like, I confess, like, I will allow myself to be like, I'm relatively easy to like emotionally manipulate in terms of like particularly movies and books. Like, so like right after watching them or finishing the book, if I read it quickly, I tend to be like very sort of positive or excited. And so like I remember like walking out of the big theater that it was performed in and like thinking, wow, like I didn't expect that to be any good, but like wow, it's so strong and emotional and like wow, I have all the feels right now, you know, except people didn't say that in 2002, but like all of these kinds of things. But like basically I think it's fair to say that from that second onward until the present day, every time I have thought about Rent, I have hated it more and more.
Yeah, that's generally the response.
Yeah, and so like a month after having watched this show, when I was just furious about how bad it is and like how emotionally manipulative and how false everything that it says about what an artist is and like what a person is, like all of these things. And then it was a super hot take and I eventually had to just like shut up about it because it was like, this is how you lose friends. Like also apparently hating Les Miserables is also apparently how you do this. P.S. like cover your ears if you like Les Miserables because it's a terrible play. But
I love
but
Les Mis.
it's the worst. Yeah,
the movie is
really
terrible, but
charming.
I love it.
Yeah, it's awful. But anyway, that's just to say that yeah. So I'm really glad.
Would you just mind for me off
Yes.
air writing a list, just a real quick list of things you like? Because I feel like it wouldn't take you long.
I like most things. I just don't like things that are bad.
Oh God. You do have a very liberal definition of what's emotionally manipulative. And I think we've avoided that conversation long enough that I just really want to understand what you define as being emotionally manipulative versus just being emotionally provocative in a healthy way. And I think that's going to be important for this. But I also, because I really want to have a sincere dialogue for my own sake about sort of the pros and cons of this cliche and this archetype of the tortured artist, maybe it'd be good. I'll just throw out the notes that I see in that film as representing that archetype.
Oh yeah,
and
dude.
If you disagree with any of them or have any ones that you'd like to add to it, like throw those on the pile. But this idea of the tortured artist is someone who is almost Christological, almost Christ-like in the intensity with which they commit to their craft, to the art, in the same way that Christ committed to his mission and to our, to salvation, right? So you're willing to essentially sacrifice everything for the art and for the craft, and it's bigger than you, and it'll outlive you. And I saw Tick, Tick, Boom as doing that, and I saw Jonathan Larson, at least within the narrative of the movie, thinking of himself that way. There's literally a moment at a party where this very sort of Midwestern, boorish person is going on and finally thinks to ask Jonathan Larson who he is. And he says, I'm the next big thing in musical theater. That's how he introduces himself. Right. So there's starting off of like this martyr complex of I am a big deal, but also I am nowhere near as big a deal as the art itself. And I'm suffering and getting everything up for that. And so the first thing is, And part of the reason I struggle with this is because it is so, the tortured artist thing is so, like, fits in so comfily, is comfily a word? Fits in so comfortably with what I think is a distortion of kind of pop Christianity and specifically pop Catholicism too, which is just suffering for suffering's sake.
Oh,
I'm a
sure.
good Catholic because I'm miserable and I'm poor and I wear dark clothes and they're itchy and I don't love my husband and I have 12 children that I can't name. And that's very, very similar to the tortured artist thing of just like, I am suffering for suffering's sake, and that somehow makes me a good artist in the same way that it would make me a good Catholic if that's the reason I was doing it. So that is perhaps the biggest thing there. But other things I notice in the film and in the life of Jonathan Larson, at least based on how he wants us to understand his life in this autobiographical thing he puts together, is art really does take precedent over other people and their needs and their feelings, especially relationship. Again, there is a sort of parody of Christ here. And I'm not trying to say, some people listening to this might come into this podcast with the framing device of thinking we're going to be speaking theologically and morally because we happen to be Catholic and you happen to be a monk, right? But you shouldn't do that. This is an art podcast. So when I say the word that I'm about to say, I'm not doing so in sort of a Bible Belt Christian-y kind of a way. I'm saying this in a purely literary and narrative way. But I mean, Jonathan Larson, narratively speaking, is the Antichrist, right? I mean, he's a parody of Christ, and the tortured artist is a parody of Christ, where I am celibate for the sake of my art. I shun worldly relationship, and I suffer for the sake of my art. I shun worldly things like comfort and a house, and I live with 14 roommates, and I have no water, and ultimately, spoilers, I guess, but it's also history. Jonathan Larson does die for his art ultimately, and is revered even at the opening performance of Rent, which he dies only a week before it comes out, pretty much, I think. Tragically, he doesn't get to see his own success. He ends up being sort of revered at the opening of that show by the cast members who announce his death to the audience at the beginning of the show as a Christ-like figure, having given himself for his art, and we will remember him by doing this play in remembrance of him.
Right.
And I'm not picking on Jonathan Larson for that, because I think Jonathan Larson is just another person in this long line of tortured artists going all the way back to the beginning of time that think that that's the way to do it. I have to, suffer for my art. I have to, be celibate for my art. I have to, or at least not engage in relationship for the sake of my art, emotionally celibate for my art. And I should ultimately give myself so towards it that it crucifies me, and I will live on through it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that anti-Christ element to the tortured artist is what, from both a theological and an artistic and a psych perspective, label it to me as immediately toxic. And yet, that doesn't make it any easier for me to extricate myself from.
Right. Yeah, I could see that.
It doesn't make it any easier to not compare myself to. And in my dark moments where I'm not feeling like a quote-unquote good artist, or worse, a real artist, which who the hell knows what that means, that sort of motif of the torture artist still, despite my shame about it, becomes my metric again.
Right. Yeah. I would add to that. I would say, I think it would help to go a little bit deeper, just because, or to put in a little bit of a context, because you said, like tortured artists from the beginning of time, but I do think that this idea as like a cultural structure, it does have a little bit of a genesis. Like it in its current mode, it has a beginning in time. Like, this is
okay.
I'd say there are obviously certain aspects of this that you're going to find through history, but like, I think in its current mode, it has a beginning in time, which is very connected actually with the 18th century philosopher Emmanuel Kant. So he had this. He has this very influential. So one of his critiques, he there's these structural critiques of what philosophy is and like how to think about it and how to kind of imagine and stuff. And so he writes one about beauty, basically, and presents a kind of theory of art and a theory of beauty and a theory of nature and these things in it. And it's extremely influential. It's one of the major works that sort of invents what you could call aesthetics, the study of beauty as a philosophical and conceptual discipline, sort of with its own integrity and its own history. And he has this very, very, very strongly phrased idea where he kind of almost invents the idea of the artistic genius. In fact, strictly speaking, he does actually invent this idea of the artistic genius, that there are just kinds of people who can do things that other people can't do, that the real artists are these geniuses. You think maybe like a child prodigy, or maybe like a Da Vinci or like a Michelangelo, who just every time they turn around, they're like sketching something new and they're doing this, and then they're changing history, and then like they're just, and this is how Jonathan Larson is presented in the film, both kind of
how he
problematically,
wants to be seen,
and that he's sort of like every time he turns around, he's like coming up with another song, and the music just kind of spills out of him, and it's like his whole life, and it is both real and fake and all those kind of things. But I think that idea of the artistic genius at the beginning is a really serious part of the problem. That part of the reason why you get this idea that like the real artist should be like tortured and can't live a normal life because like his or her art is just going to have to like consume everything else. At the back of that is this idea that that's what a real genius does. Somebody who has who is not like a normal person, who isn't in fact, strictly speaking, a normal person. Like they have gifts, like even cognitive and conceptual gifts that other people don't have, that there just really are like almost like a different species, and that like it's the most beautiful, like the most important people, but then it comes with all this terrible suffering because, oh my gosh, and I actually think that it's helpful to get down to the bottom of that artistic genius problem and identify it as such, and see what's false about that. Actually,
that's a really interesting thing to delve into, because as soon as you say it, it makes sense that would have to be something that we talked about in this conversation, but it's not something that occurs to me in this conversation. One sort of 2 cents to add to your thing there, and then a question. So first, I would say that this sort of I'm not like regular people, I am a person, but there's something more to me than other people, is again this sort of antichrist parody, right? He is fully man, but then he's also God on top of that. And like, I am fully man, but I'm also a genius on top of that. There is a Christ, a Jesus parody here that I see happening, and you're just deepening my resolve that that's the case. But I'll throw in my question / the pause that I'm feeling. I'm feeling my emotional hackles going up a little bit as you say that it has a clear genesis with Kant, because and it was Kant, you said, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to, because like being a recovering student of Franciscan University, like every one of the world's evils every single one is consistently just Nietzsche and Kant and Nietzsche and Kant and Nietzsche and Kant. And before Nietzsche and Kant, everything was perfect.
Oh no, but Nietzsche's so great. Kant is terrible, but Nietzsche's so great. Are you kidding me?
Oh my God. Literally, I had 3 classes in graduate level psychology that like a third of them were just talking about how bad Nietzsche was. And I'm like, this isn't
but he's
psych.
so great. Oh,
this isn't
sad. Oh, but he's so great.
So I'm immediately sort of getting a little bit of emotional and spiritual acid reflux.
Sure.
It reminds me of this idea that everything was perfect before these 2, quirky white boy philosophers decided to open their mouths. And then the other part that's confusing me, although I'm willing to admit my own obtuseness here, is that I have seen so many quote unquote historical geniuses before that time framed this way, that it makes it hard to believe that wasn't a thing in their own time. So you mentioned Michelangelo. I mean, I was very young when I saw Charlton Heston's The Agony, the Ecstasy, right? Where Charlton Heston is playing Michelangelo, and he's this tortured artist, and he's living in a cave because he just wants to be that close to the marble, and he's filthy and he stinks, and everyone hates him, but he knows he's going to be a big frickin' deal. And then the Pope decides, yeah, like, I get you, man, but I got to rein you in because I'm your patron. And Michelangelo's like, don't rein me in, man. Get off my ass, Pope man.
You're not my dad. But man,
like, the more you research it, the more it's like, okay, was this untrue? Like, these things do feel like they all happened. Like the Pope, or one of them did punch the other one. I forget who, because they were so mad at each other during this project. And like one of the, like, and he did do like the living in the cave with the marble thing. And there's actually a really cool Michelangelo movie coming out by one of your favorite filmmakers that I really want to see with you soon. We were talking about the trailer. And so like my earliest understanding of this idea was based on him. And then there's like a great show that I watched about William Shakespeare that frames him this way. Like, yes, I have 3 kids, and yes, I'm married to this woman, but I'm going to leave them behind in Stratford-upon-Avon. I'm going to move to London, and I'm going to be a real writer. And I mean, I guess you're arguing that all of that is just modern framing for a historical reality, or is there some part of their lives that they did think of themselves that way, or other people thought of themselves that way, even in their own age?
I think that's, I know exactly. And of course, like, well, even as I'm talking, like, I'm also thinking, the famous Peter Shaffer movie and play Amadeus, right, about Mozart, which is all this, and I think I'm mad in love with Peter Shaffer, and I think that movie is really brilliant. But
okay, we'll add that to the list of things you actually like.
Yeah. See, hey, listen, that's right. Give me credit. Also, everything by Peter Shaffer. Check. That's a lot of checks. There we go. But so obviously I'm thinking of that too, and I definitely don't want to make, human possibility like is immense, and so I don't want to make a strictly speaking a universal argument here, but what I'm saying is that as a cultural concept, as a strong cultural concept, that this is what an artist is and is like, this is something that has a very strong particular intellectual genealogy associated with this particular development of a notion of what art is, and how art is and the processing of beauty is a kind of consciousness and a kind of knowledge,
like a superpower.
It's a particular access to reality and a kind of knowledge. This is why it's really important for Kant, that some people simply have more access to than and only the genius really has like the level of access to it that you really need for like art. And like so that's the kind of thing I'm really pointing to. It does become tough, like those examples that you're talking about, because I'm going to say straight up, like anybody who's making a strong biographical argument about like interior motivations of Shakespeare, that is all like modern projections, because we know so little about.
We don't even know if he really existed. Yeah. So
so that is 100% modern projection in that particular example. Perfectly fine, but like definitely a modern projection. I actually don't. This is interesting, but like I saw Amadeus when I was quite young and thought it was really interesting, and I just recently resaw it and everything, and I love it so much, but like I don't actually know anything about like the historical Mozart. Like I don't actually know how accurate it is. For Shaffer's art, I don't think it matters, technically speaking, because of what he's doing with it. But in any case, so I don't want to make a strong case like these things literally never happened, but as like a broad cultural idea, like you could say, a meme in the sort of Richard Dawkins sense, like this cultural meme, this transmission of this idea that becomes very sticky, and then becomes such a sticky idea that it begins to shape people to itself. That takes up a very particular strength from the end of the 18th century into the 19th century that we then receive, So,
again, we're speaking really broadly because there are obviously lots of different cultures. Like, for instance, the Maya viewed artists as I have read anyway, as a priestly class or different things
interesting.
Like this.
Yeah,
so
sure. Yeah, we were just talking about Western Europe and America right now.
Like, definitely.
Yeah, obviously.
But in a Western Civ 101 kind of a context, how would you say artists were viewed before this idea was propagated by Kant and then his,
Yeah. Now, this is a really interesting thing that there is some really fascinating contemporary research on. So, like, in say the fourth century, when there's all kinds of absolutely amazing sort of Roman very late imperial art, and sort of what we call like late antique stuff going on. And and it just, there are a lot of artists, there are a lot of artisans, and it's a perfectly established thing. And there's a real question about like what kind of place these people occupied on the social ladder. Very helpfully, Emperor Diocletian, of the Diocletian persecution fame, it's the last great persecution of Christianity, that killed a lot of people. He, before declaring war on Christianity, he issued a price edict from 302, I believe, in which he, because whatever, inflation was going out of control, and like there were all kinds of problems with the empire. And so he, so in 302, he publishes this list of like, this is what things cost now, just boom, centrally directed. And
like
in
the
it,
federal government with milk during the Great Depression.
What?
I just watched a documentary on this, that no one wanted milk anymore, so they just locked in how much it could cost so that it could never go down. Like there was this weird cabal between the United Dairy Farmers and the federal government, where they were just literally milk can't cost less than this.
Oh my gosh!
And
I knew all. My whole life, I feel like
I've known campaign comes from this.
No way, really? I feel like my whole life I always knew that that the milk industry, the milk lobby, was secretly calling all of the shots. But now I know it for sure.
Surprising number of them, anyway. So Diocletian.
So Diocletian, he sets these prices, and it's really interesting because he also sets like basically wages for various employments.
Yeah, standardizes it.
And so for I forget right now if it's a painter or a sculptor, gets something like 150 sesterces a day, and then like by comparison, like a street sweeper gets like 20. So you can say like, oh well, that's okay. I mean, that's significantly higher, and so that a street sweeper is going to be a pretty low, about almost as low as you can get on the social hierarchy, and ours is significantly higher than that. So it seems like they would be, they're certainly not considered dregs, right? But there's this interesting contemporary art historian who makes named Yasha Elsner, who makes a argument that in fact they were still considered to be pretty low on the social hierarchy. Which I do think was relatively common culturally. For instance, just jumping a little bit to Japan, which is what I sort of know. Artists were generally considered very low, very low. Very low on the social hierarchy. And even when they were quite successful, I mean, there could be rich artists and stuff, but they did tend to be considered to be pretty low. So yeah, I mean, I definitely think a lot of times and places in history, if you just sort of like spin the globe and spin time and stick your finger in two different directions and land on somewhere, odds are pretty high that like artists, along with actors specifically, are probably going to be around the scale of like your prostitute and whatever. So
who also would make a lot of money but would not be seen as necessarily the nicest way to have made that money.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And there's no social protections for you, and like, okay, all this kind of stuff. So, and again, I'm not. There are certainly times and places where individual artists are really super duper revered, but I mean, I do think you see a cult of the artist, the individual artist, growing pretty dramatically in the Renaissance, and it kind of grows from there, which is partly what's feeding into these sort of Renaissance, the quote unquote Renaissance men are definitely what's a major part of what's conceptually feeding Kant's ideas. So I just think that we're kind of at a place right now where broadly considered, like an artist, it both occupies this weird cultural zone where like there's plenty of like cultural places in contemporary America where you could go, and I'm sure I'd be curious what your thoughts are on this, but like where like if you tell people like I'm an artist, it's kind of like, ooh, Boo.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I but then there are others where it would be like, it would be the biggest boast or the biggest way that you could boast your boost your social cachet in a gathering would be to say like, well, I'm an artist, like,
Well, if
what's
you're
your
already
experience
successful.
of that? What's your experience of that? Like,
Well, I mean, I think it's if you're already successful, right? Because even in these sort of stereotypically artistic communities, you walk in, you say that you're an artist, and you are just like Jonathan Larson in the film, who's a waiter talking to other waiters, and is like, well, I'm working as a waiter, but really I'm a script writer. And everyone goes, yeah, all right. Yeah, sure you are. I mean, the
right.
communities that we've sort of set up for the arts, LA and parts of New York and things like this, are perhaps the most cynical out of anyone about anyone who says that they're an artist. And then on an individual basis, furthermore, yeah, there's the traditional sort of stereotypical Midwestern ma and pa who say, oh, we don't want no son of ours to be an artist, and we want you to go out and make money and be a doctor or a farmer like your pa or whatever it is, right? Which, again, we're dealing in cliches and stereotypes here, but that's the nature of the tortured artist, right? And so I think it's interesting because normally when there's a big philosophical shift historically, one thing gets abandoned and another thing gets adopted. But I don't think that happened here. It sounds to me like we maintained all of the it's grubby and undesirable to be an artist in Western society, but it's mystical and sacred and special underneath it, right? Which almost
Sure.
becomes sort of a psychological, I would argue it becomes sort of a psychological coping mechanism to the abuse, where it says, well, no one believed in me, but that's okay, because the real reason they didn't believe in me is because I'm just so gall darn special.
Yeah,
and
they can't see it. They can't see it. I'm just so amazing.
Right.
I mean, it's like the, that really, 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 really emotionally and psychologically unhealthy place with people can get in, where they say like, if I just died, then everyone would understand. Once they'll find
then
out,
they'd be
like,
sorry.
They'll understand. They'll be sorry. It is kind of that just played out as like a whole like self-conception. Not just like a weak emotional moment because you're feeling misunderstood or whatever, but like a whole, like, this is who I am.
And look, everyone's got coping mechanisms. I'm not knocking coping mechanisms. Whatever you got to tell yourself to get through the trauma, man. I mean, sure, fine, for a time anyway. But what's interesting about people judged me, but that's just because I'm special and I'm a tortured artist, as a coping mechanism, is that it becomes oddly self-fulfilling, which is the basis and the premise of Rent, right? There is this generation of people, or this cross-generational type of person who says, I want to be an artist, and mom and pop don't understand, and my small Midwestern town doesn't understand, so I'm going to go off to the big city and become a real artist. There are those genuine people. But then that becomes so part of the cultural identity of what it means to be an artist that then you get kids like the ones depicted in Rent, who there is literally a song which in the terrible film version comes like halfway through, but in the original show opens the show so you know exactly what they're talking about, where very well-intentioned and loving parents are calling and saying like, hey honey, I haven't heard from you in 6 months, just calling again. I would love to give you some money to help you like with your next performance, like if you want to come back and visit, like we'd be happy to host you, like being as supportive as they can possibly be. And the chorus is all of our protagonists saying, screw these old people who don't understand our real art, because they need so badly to categorize these people as unsupportive in order to validate the narrative that to be a real artist is to be unsupported. And so genuine lack of support becomes so romanticized that I need to be unsupported in order to continue validating myself. And that's actually what Rent is parodying, right? I mean, you know, it's very easy with a 90s mythology lens to watch that show in its time and say, this is a celebration of this. But I think I would argue, and rightfully, I think he did this rightfully so, that Jonathan Larson was comparing people who actually had some real shit to deal with, you know, the folks who were dying of the AIDS crisis and being ignored by society. And then, you know, look at these privileged white kids who just want to play artist, and their central conflict is they don't want to pay rent from last year, right? I mean, the chorus of the show is literally, "We don't want to pay last year's rent." Like, screw you, dude. Like, you've been given a year extension on rent. Like, you are not the good guy in this.
No, it's true. Yeah, right.
But that's what
right.
you need. That you need to believe that about yourself. That you are that persecuted. That you are that much a victim in order to maintain feeling like a real artist once you buy into this. And that too, not to beat the drum of this insight that I feel proud of myself for having, but that too is sort of anti-Christ, anti-Christological, right? Because, a prophet is not understood in his hometown, and my family doesn't understand me, and I'm different, and I'm on the street, and yes, I'm specialer than everybody else, ontologically so, but also I'm rejected by everybody, and that is the dualism, the dichotomy in which I exist as the savior of mankind. I am both the greatest of us and the lowest of us. And so I really do feel quite strongly that there's something satanic in both a literary and narrative way, and also maybe in a genuinely spiritual way, about buying into this "I'm such a torture artist" thing, because it does parody Christ's narrative, at least in the sort of hero's journey way that we sometimes laugh about so closely.
Right.
And yet, even as we're talking about this, I don't want to sound snobbish and like look down on people who buy into this because of two things. One, to be an artist is very, very, very hard. It's extraordinarily hard. You don't make a lot of money unless you're super successful. You do get judged by an awful lot of people. Even people who like you greet you with skepticism. I mean, you've talked about on this podcast how, like, I told you I was an artist, and you were like, "Oh yeah," and you were like dreading actually seeing.
Please don't ask me to look at your stuff.
Right,
Oh,
you were
no.
dreading seeing my shit because you were so sure that you were gonna have to lie to me, and then ostensibly you actually liked it enough to not lie to me, although I don't know for sure. But it is hard to do that. And you do have to make tremendous sacrifices, and we need coping mechanisms. We need to be able to romanticize those experiences in order to survive them. I have friends who are working on Broadway right now, which is no easy thing in a pandemic, and they are living, 10 people to a 1-bedroom apartment.
Oh man.
And this is the thing. But they get through it because they say, "Hey, I'm doing it for the art. This is what real art is about. This is what being a real artist is." And I don't want to snobbishly take that away from them. Like, that's a brave choice they're making for the lifestyle they want to lead. It's certainly the same choice that's being romanticized in Tick, Tick, Boom, because, there's I think a great number. I personally love the song where Jonathan Larson's good friend is quote unquote selling out. He's a great artist, but he's going to join the suits and the white collars at the advertising agency. And it's sort of a last shameless, drunken 3 a.m. bid to get his friend to stay with him in the squalor and continue being artists. He sings this song called Bohemia, which ends up sort of being a precursor to the song La Vie Bohème in Rent, where he does do exactly that. He romanticized the idea of, we've had 14 roommates in the last 3 years. There's no water coming out of the sink. There's no light. But he needs to romanticize this in order to keep his friend there and also to keep himself there, because he knows he's on the edge of giving up on this dream that he has. And so, now, again, number one, I don't want to be snobbish about people who buy into this idea, because I recognize that the main reason why we want to buy into this idea is because we're in tremendous discomfort and pain, and this is what we need to sleep at night. The second reason I don't want to judge people who do this, though, is because I do this, as I already said, where, like, anytime it starts to get really hard, and, like, my mentor won't email me back for some reason and hasn't for 3 months, and my one art client, either keeps rejecting my stuff or, worse, is asking me to do something with the art that's really problematic. Like, I had an art client who wanted me to take literally any non-white person out of it, because and I was like, I'm not going to do that. Like, how do I put my name on this? But now I have to, in order to stand up for my principles, like, lose out on the money. And, like, so I get it. But every time that happens, I can either comfort myself by saying this is what a real artist would do, or I can, if it gets hard, wonder, like, is this because I'm not a real artist? Right. And so as much as I can kind of cerebrally in my adult self, as it were, to use psych language, identify this as some toxic ass bullshit, I don't know in my darkest moments how to fight it. And I don't begrudge
Sure.
anyone else who does. And I guess before I ask you to help me deconstruct it, as I previewed at the beginning of this episode, you're working your ass off on your own art form, which, let's be honest, is not going to be widely celebrated. You're writing about, medieval, philosophers on beauty. I mean, this is not like it's going to be, highly sought after by big movie studios or something. You're.
Oh, it is. Oh no, don't worry. No. I'm just holding out. I'm just holding out for the film deal. Otherwise,
Chris
yeah, no,
Columbus,
it's incredible. I don't even sleep. It's just like I spend all day drinking and like writing about, just like screaming out the window at night about like what a genius I am.
Sure.
It'll happen.
But you also have told
normal.
me, and I don't want to air your dirty laundry, but you also told me like I'm so far behind in this, and I'm really stressed out, and like that could be just the pure practical of like, gall darn, I'm really overwhelmed. But I imagine, like, I don't think you're such a perfect person that you can't have some degree of existential angst mixed into that as well.
For sure. So for me, for these things, like, I mean, this is definitely a personality thing, but for me, the real danger here is romanticism with a capital R, which is to say, what I associate with romanticism. Actually, it is the kind of capital R romantic movement is coming out of Kant and very heavily influenced by his ideas, specifically by this idea of the artistic genius, who then becomes a kind of tortured genius. Think poetically, think like Byron. Where
I was just going to say Byron. It's like
me, and I'm so amazing. I
slept with my sister, but it's not because I'm weird. It's because you don't understand me.
It's because I'm so beautiful, So there's all this.
Why don't I just do Byron as Alan Rickman?
It's hard
that
to
just
say.
Came natural. I was just like, Byron is Alan Rickman.
I just want you to run with that. Yeah, exactly. Right. So like. So there's this whole thing that there's all this drama around it, and that like this is some kind of higher life and a more elevated and dramatic thing, that again, like, I'm a special person, and that even my sufferings are a special person's kind of sufferings, and all of this, and I think that's all both profoundly untrue and deeply unhealthy, like psychologically and as a human being, like. That we create best in the same way in which we live best, which is by like seeing the truth better. And the more that we can see the thing that we're doing for what it is and accept it as such, and accept its costs as such, then the more we can really thrive in it and learn to love it and learn to accept it. So like this is the thing, it's always a false gambit to lie to yourself. It's always a false gambit to lie to yourself. It's always a false gambit to use a lie to motivate yourself, and it's always a false gambit to use a lie to make yourself feel better. And so like, in fact, because in part, one of the reasons why, only one of them, and not necessarily the biggest one, is because then we build up false expectations about what this could possibly be like at the end. They can never be satisfied, and so somehow the gratification is always delayed and always disappointing. Everything's anticlimactic and whatever. But the big thing is just that there's such a discipline to learning to live in the truth in really practical, concrete, day-to-day ways, and I think a creative life, which is to say a life spent making, whether you want to say whether it's art or music or writing, or dance or whatever, is one that, especially because of the cultural moment in which we live, that there's a very strong tendency to motivate self and and justify this life decision by romanticism about spinning great myths about what this is and who I am and the kind of thing that I'm doing. Where I think the real thing, like the truth, is more beautiful. So, like, what do I mean? I mean that the creative process is actually not something that is very sexy. like I have a really good friend a couple of good friends who were sculptors, really talented sculptors, and like, listen, I mean, sculptors, like, they kind of have to be beefy dudes because like you're sort of like hauling stone, and you just spend like kind of a lot of the day like hitting a hammer, and you get covered in dust, and it's like it's hard in various things. um it's not it isn't actually romantic. Like, it's very practical. It's very nitty gritty. um but that's actually good, right? Like, that's actually where the labor and the labor of and for beauty really comes in, is this like, I'm hitting this hammer now, I'm doing this thing now, I'm practicing this drawing again, I'm working on my prose again, I'm researching this thing a little bit more closely. These things that are not romantic and ought not to be made sexy. They just are what they are, and that it's in wanting to do that little thing well that we actually begin to discover like greatness.
I'm struggling to see well, not to see, but to put my finger on the exact difference that you're trying to highlight between, on the one hand, hey, this isn't sexy and that's part of it, I'm going to carve the marble and get covered in dust. And on the other side, hey, it isn't sexy to have 14 roommates, but that's part of it. This is what being an artist is.
Oh yeah. That's good. No, thank you. I wasn't that. You're right. You're thinking that wasn't a clear division.
I mean, it sounds to me like you're saying it's in the smallness of it, where I'm just focusing on this cut of the marble as opposed to the ultimate goal of like, and it's all going to be worth it someday because I'm famous. But that maybe isn't what you're saying.
That's definitely part of it. But okay. Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And also it's letting go of any sort of big drama about it. Like, it doesn't have to look a certain way. Like, I don't have to like live in squalor, drink too much, have a bunch of broken relationships. Like, that doesn't make me a great artist, or just like not ever letting myself sleep or whatever, like, doesn't make me get my work done any faster, like all of these things, like the sort of stereotypes of this kind of tortured artist stuff. Actually, like, go ahead and let them go, and just do the thing that you need to do every day that you can manage to do it, and just see what happens, like, because okay, so let me propose as a kind of sort of an illustration.
Please.
There is something really captivating about a figure like the Peter Schaeffer's Mozart. There's something really captivating about like a Caravaggio or something. Well, actually, maybe nobody's super captivated by it. Nobody really wants to be Caravaggio, but like, whatever.
One of Jonathan Larson.
That good bio Jonathan Larson, that there's something captivating about this, and like it's exciting, in a certain way, and like it does seem like a beautiful life, even with all of its pain. There are certainly people who work like that, artists who work like that. But like a really interesting counterexample that just proposes kind of a different way of being an artist is so there's this guy, Anthony Pohl, who's a British novelist in the middle of the 20th century, who he just had a kind of daily regimen. I think every day he would write, I don't know exactly how much, like 1,000 words. It was a challenging daily regimen, actually, quite a challenging regimen. But he said daily regimen that he would write, like 1,000 words or so, and that's that. And there's a biography of him, and the biographer is a talented woman, because it's there aren't like a huge like sexy and then everything wow, because like no, he just basically woke up every day and like wrote 1,000 words and went to bed. And the magnum opus that he produced is this novel cycle called A Dance to the Music of Time that is certainly unquestionably one of the 5 greatest literary works produced in the 20th century. It's genuinely something for the ages. It's just there is simply not enough praise that can be given to this work. And it doesn't, and this was its genesis. is this very kind of unromantic. Just like there was a guy who just thought really, he just made, worked hard and thought carefully his way through what was going to be a 12 novel cycle, and then wrote a 12 novel cycle, like about 1,000 words a time over the course of something like 20 years. I forget how long it took him. And that's it, you wouldn't look at that life and be like, wow, he's like a totally different kind of person, and like, wow, like I'm gonna like, this is incredible. And then like, but where does the absinthe come in, and like where does the like breaking up with your friends, and like where does the screaming on the roof at night, like the answer is it doesn't come in. He just did it.
Yeah. I'm having this thought. Because, all right, let's get really, really vulnerable for a second. And you can't leave me hanging. You're going to have to be vulnerable too, because I'm a straight white male, and if I'm vulnerable, you have to be vulnerable too, so that I don't feel weak. But I've been feeling lately as far away from my professional goals as I've ever have. And I keep going back to this feeling. I think it was like 8 years old. And my mom and I were swimming down this river, and there were supposed to be turtles at the place that we were going to end up swimming to. I was so freaking excited to see these turtles, and we were like pushing ourselves, and neither one of us, my mom is still not a great swimmer. I mean, I'm still not a great swimmer, but especially at 8, I was not a good swimmer at all. And I was pushing myself really hard to get to that point. And the further I would swim, the more the current would sort of push me back.
Oh man, yeah.
And right. I keep going to the degree that we did almost drowned.
Oh wow, wowzers!
And we ended up managing to pull ourselves up on some rocks, and people on the way back were able to sort of like up the river were able to notice us and like come to our pseudo rescue. It was this sort of traumatic event, and I keep going back to that event lately, feeling like that's what's happening to me professionally, where like the harder I swim towards this goal, like the further back somehow I slide. But as you're talking about it, and you're talking about just the focus on the now instead of like the destination. I mean, I guess it could be reductionistically taken down to just focus on the journey rather than the destination, but it's moving to me because it's how much cool shit did I miss pushing myself that hard to swim that hard because I wanted to get to that destination. And the artistic equivalent of what I should have done there is, I think, doing exactly what you're talking about, where am I just doing something cool that I'm proud of, like right now? Like, as we always say at the closing of this podcast, like, am I just creating cool things? Like, am I doing that, or is it all based on getting to see the turtles at the end of the river? And I think that, if you are just doing it based on getting to see the turtles at the end of the river, yeah, you're going to exhaust yourself. And you can romanticize that exhaustion and say, oh, this is what makes me a real swimmer, or this is what makes me a real artist. But ultimately, you're just missing out. Yeah. And I think that's really, I got to sit with that because that's really poignant.
Yeah, no, I really do appreciate that. And yeah, it's funny. Like I have labored very hard for a very long time to like root out sort of romanticism, and I feel like I'm very allergic to it in a lot of things. And like when you hear me like hating on a lot of like literary and like movie type things, like mostly it's because I recognize like romantic traits in it that I think are like bad for human beings or whatever. But you know,
when you say, and just to be clear, like when you say romantic, you mean
capital R.
Yeah, you don't mean like people loving
sexy
each other.
Things.
Or
No.
You mean like
R.
specifically fetishizing something that shouldn't necessarily be held up as an ideal.
Yeah, this whole like the whole capital R romantic movement.
Right.
Yeah. No. I don't mean no. Obviously not. But thank you for clarifying.
I just wouldn't want someone listening and being like, "Oh yeah, of course the priest doesn't like romance."
Of course the priest hates romance. Yeah. No. Exactly.
His
But of course,
girlfriend
like,
took him to Rent, and he never liked romance again.
Ever.
That's when he became celibate.
Done. That was right. Exactly. It had to happen sometime. But but obviously, like, whatever, just a person, and it is funny. So yeah, so you mentioned, like, so I'm working on this dissertation right now, and I've written big stuff before, like academic stuff before, but there's never something like this, never something this big. And you set these goals and you work towards them, and I just felt like, man, I was just like genuinely working as hard as I possibly could, and just like wasn't getting anywhere. And I would say the last month it was actually really tough for me, because I was starting to feel like, oh my gosh, this chapter was like 5 months delayed, 5 months late. And I was like legitimately, I'm so embarrassed about this, but I was like legitimately avoiding my advisor, who is like an absolutely amazing woman, and is like incredibly supportive. And I was like not reaching out to her because I was so embarrassed to admit that, like, I was already behind, so far behind.
Not unlike the kids in Rent are avoiding the calls of their parents trying to be supportive, and they're like, no, I need to be a real artist, so I can't call them back.
I just need to feel this. And I admit, like, even I need to feel like bad, because I deserve to feel bad, because I'm not done, and I need to, like, feeling bad. See, but this is also the sickness, right, of the, like, the tortured artist thing. Is like, no, but I need this because it will motivate me, and like, right. But not quite realizing that's actually part of the whole problem of why I'm not getting stuff done in the right pace. But
yeah, the pain is an addiction and a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, and just its own kind of, like, unhelpful addition to the mix. I come to this, like, right now, to this conversation right now, having had, like, a big kind of cathartic moment of, like, I just a couple days ago sort of handed off a complete draft of that chapter I was much delayed on to my advisor, and, like, I feel just, like, great about that.
Yeah, screw you, man. I suggested this topic last week because I thought we were both in this mode, and you had this cathartic mountaintop moment.
Boom, there I did.
You should have postponed it one more week.
That's right. Be much more miserable. But one thing that's interesting for me is I have had a number of experiences where well, let me just propose this particularly. I got to this place a couple years ago where so I showed up to graduate school, and was intending to, like, kind of slow play learning German because I needed to know it, but I thought I'll pick this up over the course of the next few years. And then I realized very shortly that I needed to, like, already had known German, like, before I showed up on the scene, which of course was now too late. My time machine turned out not to work strictly in that sense, so that I was stuck.
Side note, that was exactly my experience going to grad school with like Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator, where I was like, I'm going to school to learn these things. And they show up on day one. It's like, so everyone knows how to use Adobe Suite, right? I'm like, shit.
Yes, of course I do. Yeah,
I'm a real manual. Artist.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I just, like, it was insane, but I sort of got to a pretty functional place in German over the course of, like, 9 really insanely intense months. And I mean, the process by which I learn languages is definitely, like, asterisk, don't try this at home, but, like, there were often times where, like, even knowing that, like, I was going as fast as I possibly could, and that, like, being excited that I was making progress in various ways and stuff, like, there's still this really frustrating, like, seeing how much lay ahead and, like, how much I needed, and just realizing, like, I'm just not making enough progress. And then, like, there's this, like, neurotic point in the day where you sort of feel like I need to do more. I have 45 minutes left. I could do 45 minutes more of stuff. And just it was really, really, really helpful for me to realize, like, no, I have literally done what I can do today. If adding anything more onto this is not going to help. And so, like, I've done what I can do today. And now, like, because of how much I want to achieve this goal, because of how much I want to learn this thing, and because I want to, like, have the gas on full or whatever, now I have to stop and, like, watch a movie and drink a beer and then go to bed.
I have to watch Tick Tick Boom because my idiot friend wants to do an episode on this.
I did in fact do that. It was great. But you know what I mean? Like, and that particular project, there was a way of dividing it into daily sections that I realize is not always a possible thing. I mean, for instance, what I'm doing right now doesn't necessarily divide into daily sections that same way, but you know, I just really found that to be for me, it was very psychologically and even spiritually important, right? Because there's this whole like spirituality of it, of just coming to realize like, oh, right, like I can't just keep slamming on the gas and like make myself better. I have to like work with, like, I have to work with reality. That's why I'm like constantly trying to bang the drum about like the truth. Like I have to work with reality. When I'm too tired, I have to go to bed. When I've done what I can do for the day, I have to stop. When I have time set aside to do the thing that I need to do it and not like be texting or on social media or like checking my email for the 1,000th time that hour, you know, like, yeah. And I guess that's the kind of like nitty gritty, like practical, unromantic, capital R, just stuff that I think is, there can be real torture involved in it. There's a lot of asceticism, you know, it can be really difficult and especially difficult to sustain long term. But to me, like, that's honest. And because it's honest, it can produce good work.
I'm really glad that you organically and without any prompting landed on that idea of asceticism, because it is a point that I sort of previewed earlier, and one that I really don't think would be, I think we'd be really remiss if we didn't get to it. And that is this idea of sacrificing relationship for the art. You know, in the movie Tick Tick Boom, and in many of these, you know, tortured artist films, including in the 3 I watched that same weekend, our hero always gives up love for the sake of the art. You know, so Jonathan Larson ostensibly is madly in love with his girlfriend and wants to be married to her, and she with him. I mean, we don't know what was actually going on, but within the world of the movie, this is what's presented. And yet when she wants to take a job that would be outside of the city and therefore outside of his beat to like network and become a great musical composer and writer, they decide to make the quote unquote mature choice to break up with each other, even though they love one another. You know, another Lin-Manuel project, Hamilton, right? Famously, my wife just doesn't understand me. She's trying to get me to stop writing these, you know, the papers, the Federalist Papers, and she just doesn't understand me. So, you know, she's going to go away for the summer. I'm going to be totally alone, and then I'm just going to sleep with people along the way, you know, and this sort of like, again, there's no actual asceticism in the sense of surrendering sexuality, you know, not having sex with people, but there is a renunciation of worldly attachment, in a way that causes everybody in these stories an awful lot of pain, and yet which is nevertheless romanticized as a necessary sacrifice in the artistic journey. And I mean, so I will say that part I have not fallen prey to, thank Christ, to the degree that when I sort of walked out of Tick Tick Boom, one of the things that I was struggling with, and one of the things that was really validating for me, was I was saying, you know, I'm not where I want to be quite yet professionally, but I have time to get there. If I hadn't put so much effort into the friendships I have and the marriage that I have, I might already be there. And I'm not sorry that I made the choice that I did. I'm a happier and more fulfilled and better person for choosing that. So I walked out of that saying, you know what, I may have to take the long path in this cranium board called life to get to where I want to go, but at least I'm doing it with people I love as opposed to completely alone like these poor sons of bitches in these films. Contrast that, though, respectfully, with you, who are celibate. You know, you have given your sexuality entirely to this mission. Now, I mean, as a student of theology of the body, I don't think that that means that you have like rendered yourself asexual or given up your status as a sexual being. It's just that you have channeled it into something else and you're not, acting on it in a carnal way. But nevertheless, you have done what I think as Catholics anyway, we would consider the healthy version of what these fetishized, tortured artist characters seek to do. And I would just love your thoughts on, just experientially, personally, what you think the main difference is. I mean, besides the fact of just sleeping with people along the way whenever you get itchy, because it's not that sex is the problem, it's that these women don't understand you. But besides
I'm misunderstood.
that,
yeah,
right.
These women are the worst. Yeah.
Yeah, besides that though,
Yeah.
I mean, like experientially, what do you think is the difference between you and your version of this and those guys' version of this?
Sure. One pause at the beginning though, which is that, but thanks for bringing that up, because when I say asceticism, I don't actually associate that really at all with celibacy in this context.
Okay,
I mean it. I mean it specifically with like, so the Greek word like askesis, it means like discipline. And it's so it's associated with like things that are difficult and unwelcome and that are hard, that involve like renunciation of.
And you don't consider that celibacy?
Well, so I mean, but this is a broader thing. Like a mode,
okay.
one aspect of ascesis is celibacy, but like that's only one thing.
Sure.
But
sure.
like so like not getting all the sleep that I want, or like having to give up certain dreams, or like keep this mental discipline of keeping of refusing to live in an imaginary world and forcing myself to live in the truth, like which means like also coming to know myself enough to be willing to recognize the truth about myself, et cetera, et cetera. Like those things are ascetical because they involve like renouncing things that are false and renouncing things that can be like comforting and satisfying, however don't actually lead me where I want to go. So that's a kind of broader sense of asceticism that I mean there. But you bring up an important point, so it's which is to say that like we talk about say actual like celibacy, like renouncing of the specific like physical bodily generativity for the spiritual generativity of the heart. That it's interesting. There are different times and ways in which people will do this. So famously, there's this really interesting one of the most famous women who was a Soviet propagandist and like a writer and like person like promulgating the mission in like the teens and early 20s. She very intentionally like renounced marriage so that she could dedicate herself wholly to the Soviet cause. And she in fact did, and she died of overwork. So she was a tortured artist like for communism. But seeing it really specifically as in like a parody of like an atheist version of a nun.
Right.
Intentionally seeing herself as like an atheist nun.
Yeah.
So the people will do these things for we always have to consider like what's the good in itself, and then like what's the end that's pursued. So for religious celibacy, the good in itself is union with Jesus Christ, this specific whole personal conformity to Jesus Christ, that like it's a grace received from him, that is so Jesus Christ, I'm sorry, Pache, Dan Brown, and some other people, was not married, and was not like having random sexies on the side. So he's poor, he's chaste, and he is obedient to his father even unto death on a cross, right? St. Paul says in Philippians. And it's those three things that especially a religious models lives in his own experience, and desires to receive from Jesus Christ as a gift of love, so that they're primarily something that I receive, and I receive them from Jesus so that he can make me more like himself. And that's to say, that's receiving them practically, physically, is not in fact proper for every person, right? Like there are ways of life that are necessarily precluded by that, and so like a person who is married, you know, like who is gonna like promote the good of the world, and like the good of souls and his own soul and his wife's soul, as children by having physical children. This is something really beautiful, and like the physical receptions of that literal Christ likeness and like poverty, chastity, obedience is like not going to work, right? So he's given that man or woman is given a participation in those in his or her own way, you know. But for me, it's this really direct and immediate way, and that's its first and highest beauty is that it's a gift received from Jesus Christ, to share a likeness to his life on earth while I'm on earth, which is the best thing. And then you say like, so then, but then like, what is the kind of like, what is the generativity that produces, right? Because like the human person just by nature sort of generative, and like anything that is truly conducive to like what it means to be a human being is going to be bearing forth new life in some sense or another. And so for me, it's giving everything for preaching the gospel. This is the shape of my life as a Dominican, a member of the Dominican order. That's why everything. Because this is the most important thing, is to preach the gospel, to discover ways in which we can see Christ afresh, and to propose Christ afresh to people in unexpected ways, to help other people to see how beautiful he is, and to want to receive from him the gifts that are appropriate for them in their lives, you know. So like, yeah, there are many asceticisms that come with that, and one of which is totally renouncing like physical sexuality, the physical enactment of like genital pleasure, etc., whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, genitality. We can still high five, but you know.
Yeah, exactly. Like, don't touch me. Don't. Right. I am a robot. I am a robot. But this is what it does. It like sets the life free in a really particular way. But it's not just because of like, ew, gross encumbrance, like wife, children, gross. Again, it's about honesty. It's about starting in the truth, which is that like, if I want to be able to offer my life 100% for like availability to be present to people, for the sake of the gospel in these like radical and sometimes very weird ways, it is profoundly unjust to do that in the ways that I, as a member of a religious order, do. It would be profoundly unjust and dishonest to subject like a wife and children to those things.
Sure. And I recognize that you're talking more broadly about, you know, celibacy specifically, but to bring it back to a comparison to, you know, your version of that versus this sort of anti-Christological artsy fartsy version of that that's represented in stories like Tick, Tick, Boom. If I can summarize and add to it, if you think I'm summarizing too reductionistically, but I feel like the rule you're putting out there is, if you're turning away from one love in order to embrace a greater love, that is healthy. But if you are turning away from love and there's nothing you're turning to besides self, even if that version of self is your craft or your effort or whatever it is, that is objectively unhealthy. And that can look like turning away from an unhealthy dating relationship so that you can, you know, go and embrace a more filling, like married one with someone who is healthier for you. Or that can look like turning away from genitalic human to human sexual love, period, and turning towards the fuller love of God. But that's in juxtaposition, it sounds like you're saying, to this sort of, I'm just turning away from love for the sake of me and my craft. There's selfishness to one that there isn't to the other.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to say that like everything is of a piece, right? Like everything has to be of a piece. Like everything has to be contained in the same movement, you know? So like and like this is one thing that Tick, Tick, Boom I think does well, that is really that I thought was interesting, is that it does show the way in which there are irresolvable tensions for him, because he will not give up this particular vision of what artistic success looks like, and what real art is, which this in the film there isn't a distinction between those two, which is really interesting. And that like that there's a real tension that the film is sort of constantly pressing on, that like this seems to make him unavailable for love of basically any kind. And that there is a real problem here, but at the same time it kind of works, and so like you also celebrate it. So it's like it's all kind of complicated, and I mean I guess I'm happy that the film doesn't try to like give you a pat little moral at the end, but like,
which is why, by the way, I didn't consider the film emotionally manipulative, because I felt like they were letting me decide whether or not his life was really toxic or really inspiring, or combinations of both at different times. I felt like it didn't have agenda. So that's why I thought this was a particularly sober and potent example of the cliche, because it wasn't shoving like a story down my throat that way. But that was my
that's
take.
fair. Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. Yeah. So like, but like a human being has to live in relationship, and like has to be like learns to be free by learning to love, and like growing to be free in order to love, and vice versa. And that like, if I'm choosing these paths that make it impossible for me to love, or that the only thing that I'm actually able to grow in love is just myself, this is just a closing in on myself. This is actually, whatever else it might be, it is in fact a closing of horizons. It is in fact a closing of horizons. And just by like historical contrast, like if you want to see how different that is from, for instance, what like the great tortured artist's weirdo Michelangelo is doing, just read his poetry and see how insanely in love with Jesus Christ this man is. Like, this is a man who is giving everything for love. He's giving really everything for love, and it looks weird. And I think this is really important to embrace that. Like, yeah, in Michelangelo's case, it looks really weird. I mean, he would literally sleep in an unwashed heap with a bunch of like, with his, workers in the middle of the church he was painting, just because like he wasn't going to go home, and like it was cold, and they just like sleep in a dirty, gross heap. I'm like, that's that. Okay, so like, but everything he's doing is to make himself more available, to respond to the love that is moving him, and to be made more available for that love. And like, you really see it happening. Like, this is a man whom you cannot understand at all unless you understand the way in which like he is so on fire with his love for God that he does insane things with it, where like, that's the trouble. I think something is really interesting in the way that that Tick, Tick, Boom presents its character is that he wants to love, but also wants not to have to. Like there's a nice scene that's like it's actually surprisingly lightly touched on, where like he and his girlfriend are having this big fight, and she just says like, I'm always the one who's supposed to sacrifice for you because you're the great artist,
and I'm the girlfriend.
And I'm the girlfriend. And you realize like, wow, that's actually really great, because like, something about the way in which he is pursuing his art seems to think not just that he is supposed to sacrifice, but kind of even more other people are supposed to sacrifice for him. And like, they constantly have to understand that he's not going to be available when they really need it, and that they're just going to have to be available when he's available, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So like, it's just this constant closing off from love,
It's closing off from love, and I honestly think you just helped me figure out the central linchpin into why I was sensing something anti-Christological. Because all the things I was describing about the tortured artist are also true of Christ. He was specialer, but also separate and looked down upon. He was, ascetic. He did give everything for that. He does live on. And so I'm saying, okay, this is like a parody of Christ. Where's the point of deviation? And I think you just gave it to me, which is that Christ, as the fundamental aspect of his being, did not expect anyone to suffer more than him. And the tortured artist does, right? If I'm really giving everything to my art, but then I'm saying, and yes, I'm also going to lose an additional 3. I'm going to stay up till, I'm going to stay up till 3 getting my art done because I also have a baby to take care of. And I'm not going to sacrifice the baby and my baby's needs and let my wife take care of the baby because that would be easier and I can get the art done. And why can't you just understand that I'm a real artist and this is what I need to do? I'm going to be exhausted. And if I have to be exhausted to the degree of passing out to be that quote unquote real artist and also a real father and also a real husband, I mean, I should probably question that a little bit, but fine. If that's what I need to do, fine. But the moment I need everybody else, whether it's in Rent, the parents calling and saying, don't you need money? Or the girlfriend who just needs to play the role of the girlfriend, or the child who needs to play second fiddle to the art, or the God who needs to play second fiddle to the art. The second I need other people to suffer for my art more than I need to suffer for my art, even if it's just a little bit, I think that's the linchpin when it stops being Christ-like and starts being anti-Christ-like.
Sure. I think that's a helpful point. I think that's a helpful, like, sort of dividing line for where to put it. And again, like, just banging on this drum, it's because it's dishonest. I'm saying these are the sacrifices I'm making for my art, but in fact, you are just taking for granted all of the ways in which you are, like, not living the reality in which you live, that you're actually offloading a lot of your sacrifices and sufferings and stuff onto other people who haven't asked
not
for them.
paying rent for a year.
Like, for instance, not paying rent for a year, which, by the way, like, I know it's terrible to say, but landlords, actually, this is weird, but they are actually people too. And like, they also have to pay rent when you
in the same way that an
it.
artist is a higher form of person, a landlord is a lower form of person.
Just by nature,
we're all
it's
still
just how
persons.
it is. All still persons. Exactly right. That like there's this, I mean, that's it. I mean, so there's this rubric of, like, truth and love. Like, am I actually looking at the truth and then responding to the truth of, like, my real situation? And then, like, am I actually living this in a way that like allows me to grow in love? Like.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm really happy with where we've gotten to this. I'm going to be meditating on this for a long time. I'm hoping it will be a source of continued healing for me in this regard, so I can stop in the wee hours of the morning when I feel bad about myself, comparing myself to these really toxic people. I hope it'll be that way too for some of the people listening. Certainly I hope it was entertaining at the very least. But yeah, I mean, I guess from you and I both, we can't say it better than that. We hope you guys choose love, and we hope you go forth and create cool things. This has been Created Things, an art, soul, and mind production with Jacob Flores-Popchak and Father Gabriel Torretta. Production by Kyle Meineke and Jessica Flores. Theme song by Federico Carranza. For more on the podcast and on its hosts, visit artsoulandmind.com.